get to an important point that we'll undoubtedly talk about more in the LFO section, but you can modulate the VCO with noise, which is a rare functionality to find on a synthesizer, a one oscillator synthesizer of this type. It can allow you to introduce a little bit of variability into the oscillator to give it a more vintage sound. You might say, well, isn't 1983 vintage? I mean, more vintage than that. Okay, that sounds really cool. I'm sorry. I got sidetracked. Okay, so that's what your modulation does. It introduces the LFO's modulation to the frequency of the oscillator in a permanent way, as opposed to the expressive way that you can find in the bender. All right, let's talk about the sub oscillator. I'm going to set this to sawtooth. And then you can set the level of the sub oscillator. And what the sub oscillator is it is a divider connected to the oscillator that gives you a frequency that is an octave below or 2 octaves below the frequency that the VCO is set to, giving you a bassier sound. In case anyone was wondering. Okay, with this sub oscillator, you have some cool functions here that you don't often see. You have the ability to set the sub oscillator 1 octave down, which we've been hearing, or we can go down 2 octaves. We might want to bring the oscillator up a little bit so that we can actually hear that. And of course, you can mix the oscillator and the sub oscillator to get the balance you want. This is a good time to point out that the sub oscillator gives you a square wave. And all of these sounds, you're probably starting to see how this synthesizer became such an important part of the dance genres it's associated with. Those dance genres have these functions very specifically demonstrated in them. And if you want a little bit of variety, we have the ability to set 2 octaves down again, but this time with a pulse width with a square wave of a different duty cycle, giving you a different timbre. So here's the difference. There's your 2 octave down square wave. And here is your 2 octave down pulse wave. And we're only hearing the sub oscillator right now. So you have 2 different timbres to choose from in your sub oscillator, which is cool. Wide variety of possible timbres using the sub oscillator. And of course, if you want to just use the square wave from the sub oscillator on its own, you can certainly do that. You don't need the other oscillator waveforms going, as I've demonstrated, so that's cool. We also have a noise source. It's kind of to me, and maybe I'm crazy, it may be that I'm just an advanced age, but that's sounding kind of like a darker noise than white noise. It's kind of more pleasing. It's not as hissy. Or maybe my ears no longer have the frequency range to hear the high end, which is possible. Okay. So we have all of this functionality available it is a single VCO synthesizer, but they have given you all of the functions you can possibly get out of a single oscillator. Well, that's not entirely true, but at least they've given you a lot to work with. And you can do things like mixing the different waveforms to get new timbres. You can certainly have your pulse width modulated while it's mixing with your sawtooth wave. And since these two waveforms are so totally in tune because they're coming from the same oscillator, it's kind of an interesting effect to hear both pulse width modulation and a sawtooth wave happening at the same time. That was weird. Why did I think that? And keep in mind, again, that if you introduce waveforms, but you don't introduce them at a level where they become specifically audible, what you're doing is adding harmonics. And so you get a wide variety of timbres messing with just mixing the sawtooth and the square wave and the sub oscillator together at low levels. Anyway, you can get a lot out of what would be a pretty simple VCO. I mean, it's a single VCO, but they've given you the tools to make it a really interesting single VCO. So that is the VCO on the Roland SH-101.